Shilian was carried in Hua Chang's arms as they moved deeper into the darkness of the cave's innermost dens. The only source of light around them were the softly fluttering silver wraith butterflies. Shilian couldn't see the expression on Hua Chang's face clearly, but he could feel that Hua Chang's entire body was stiff. It wasn't like Hua Chang had never held him before in the past, but it was very obvious that now something had changed, and Hua Chang wouldn't touch even his neck or his hands directly. Shilian kept eyeing Hua Chang's face, blinking with force, but Hua Chang kept avoiding his eyes, refusing to meet them, and entered a cavern chamber as he willed. There was a stone bed within the cavern chamber, and he immediately brought Shilian over to set him down. Just as he was laying Shilian down, he suddenly noticed something. He checked Shilian's back and spoke. "They cast a spell on you?" Shilian was overjoyed. He'd finally discovered it. However, that it had taken Hua Chang this long to notice that something was off about Shilian only went to show just how badly Hua Chang had been caught off guard earlier. Shilian was waiting for Hua Chang to remove the command talisman from his back. Yet, unexpectedly, even though Hua Chang had already reached out, his hand paused halfway. In the end, he withdrew said hand and laid Shilian flat on the bed. Maybe it was so Shilian wouldn't worry, but he said quietly, "Your Highness, don't worry. I won't kill those 2 pieces of useless trash for now, even though I really want to murder them." Also, laid upon that stone bed was a layer of thick but soft fresh hay. Shilian was lying on top of it limply, not a bit worried, but so anxious his innards were smoking. He just couldn't understand why Hua Chang wouldn't release him from the spell. Just as he was trying desperately to struggle, he saw Hua Chang reach out toward the sash around his waist and untied that belt. Right then, in an inopportune coincidence, Shilian could feel the command talisman on his back starting to fade, and his leg jerked hard while an "ah" escaped his lips. Although it looked like nothing more than a dead fish that had twitched for a second in its last attempt at life, expressing its objection without any real power, Hua Chang still froze immediately and instantly withdrew his hand. "I won't," he said. As if Hua Chang felt his own tone was too harsh and was afraid he might have scared Shilian, making him feel repulsed. Hua Chang backed away for a few steps and softened his voice, his expression unreadable, cautious and resigned. He said quietly, "Your Highness, I won't do anything to you. Don't be scared." Shilian finally understood. Hua Chang still wasn't sure just what kind of response he would receive from Shilian upon releasing the spell, so he was refusing to hear the response altogether. Hua Chang seemed to be holding back some sort of impulse, and once again employed a voice full of assurance, speaking softly, "Your Highness, trust me." But this "trust me" sounded weak compared to the times before when he had said the same thing. Shilian wanted to answer him, but he couldn't, and he didn't dare to struggle anymore, lest the misunderstanding deepen. So he could only lie there flatly without moving, waiting for the power of the command talisman to fade. Seeing that Shilian didn't resist anymore, Hua Chang approached again, reached out, and gingerly untied Shilian's belt. "San Lang," Shilian called out mentally. He of course believed wholeheartedly that Hua Chang wouldn't take advantage of people when they were down. But this development was also completely out of his expectation, so he couldn't help but widen his eyes. While Hua Chang loosened Shilian's robes, he still tried his best not to make contact with his body, so he took his time. It was a long while before Shilian's outer robes were removed, then the underrobes. It was only when a wraith butterfly flew to the tip of Shilian's shoulder and perched, and a warm and tingling feeling crawled up his skin, that Shilian realized that his shoulders were red and slightly swollen. The skin in some areas was even cracked. It only started to heal after the silver butterfly had perched. These were frostbite injuries, left over from crawling and tumbling all over the frozen mountains. Shilian himself hadn't noticed at all, since he wasn't too sensitive to pain anymore. If he's frostbitten, then he's frostbitten. Even if he had noticed these injuries, he would probably leave them to heal on their own. However, Huacheng knew better than him where he was hurt, kept it on his mind, and had to address the injuries no matter what. Just as he was spacing out, Huacheng held and raised his arm. There was even more frostbite on his hands and feet, and because of all the desperate running and pulling, many places were already bleeding. Shilian wasn't afraid of pain, but he was ticklish. Moreover, many broken memories of the past floated into his mind in spite of himself. In a dark cave, the trembling and heated hands of a boy, random panic touches, irregular breathing, and a heart racing. These memories were originally so diminished that they couldn't be any fainter, and he had long since sealed them up, thrown them away into a corner. Now that the memories were resurfacing, they held a surprisingly different taste, making one want to hold one's head and scream, especially now that Huacheng was right in front of him, doing practically the same thing. But Shilian's face and mind were going to burn up. He was scared that Huacheng might see, but Huacheng didn't look at him at all, keeping to his promise completely, never crossing the line. He kept his head slightly turned, averting his gaze from that half-exposed, white shoulder. Yet unexpectedly, right then, a voice suddenly popped up from behind Huacheng. "Huacheng, you madman! What do you think you're doing to His Highness? You're disgusting." Huacheng whipped his head around, and Shilian also looked past him, moving his eyes to the entrance of the cavern chamber. The one who spoke was Muqing. Fengxin was also next to him. The two were only just wrapped into giant cocoons by Huacheng earlier, but they somehow broke free and found this place. When they saw the scene inside the cavern, their faces paled. Shilian's face also paled. Truly, what an awful sight. Fengxin pointed at Huacheng, then pointed at Shilian, whose clothes were half peeled. It was a good moment before he could squeeze out, You let him go, right now." Huacheng instantly pulled Shilian's clothes up and said coldly, "You two pieces of useless trash dare seek us out. I think you're tired of living." Muqing sneered. "Move your filthy hands. The ugly toad wants a taste of swan meat. Never mind you dreaming of it for 800 years. Even if you hope for another 1,000, don't you dare touch a single one of His Highness's fingers." Hearing this, Shilian's heart jerked. In between annoyance, he could sense something was wrong. What was with those two? Even if Huacheng beat them to a pulp earlier, they shouldn't be this rude facing him, especially Muqing. It was like they were trying to provoke Huacheng on purpose. There was no benefit to provoking Huacheng. They couldn't beat him, so what was their goal? Moreover, they were subtly pointing the spear in Shilian's direction with their toe, like they were begging for chaos to descend, like they were afraid Huacheng wouldn't do something to Shilian if he should be enraged. Sure enough, Huacheng was outraged, and his blanched face was flashing with darkness. He threatened softly, "Since you both came with the intention to die." Shilian could see that naked murderous intent in his eyes, and horror filled his heart. "Don't!" Too late. The scimitar was unsheathed, and Ming's cold shimmer flashed. Fengxin and Muqing were both startled, and they lowered their heads. Fortunately, there were no injuries on their bodies. Yet, unexpectedly, before they had the chance to breathe in relief or return any kind of retaliation, the next second, their upper half bodies crashed down from their lower halves with a thud. Blood spouted and gushed like mad, spilling to and flooding the ground. Shilin had never expected things to develop like this and was already completely dumbstruck, lying limply on that stone bed. Huacheng, he actually slashed Fengxin and Muqing at the waist. Those two hadn't yet died completely, and they rolled down on the ground, one gritting his teeth, the other yelling furiously, a sight too tragic to see. Huacheng's expression was frigid as he sheathed the scimitar. Only a small half of his face was spotted with a bit of blood, that tinge of red matching the aura of evil between his brows, making him appear even more striking. He stood in that pool of blood for a moment, then he looked back and walked towards Shilin. Shilin watched with his eyes wide open at Huacheng's approach with a grim expression, and only then did Shilin snap out of it. By then, Huacheng had already come to her side and clutched one of his hands. He pulled him up and pressed him hard into his embrace, whispering, "How can I possibly let go?" Shilin was wrapped tightly in his arms, unable to speak, and Huacheng whispered something else in his ears. His heart pounded wildly, like it was going to jump out of his chest, and suddenly he felt his body loosen. The command talisman Muqing drew up and taped onto his back was finally released. Even though Huacheng said he wouldn't let go, after he released Shilin from the command talisman, Huacheng still loosened his hold slightly and let Shilin go. Shilin inhaled deeply, leapt to his feet, and charged to the pool of blood on the ground. "Fengxin, Muqing, are you two all right?" Muqing's injuries were greater, and the corner of his lip was streaming blood. The light in his eyes faded. Fengxin still had a breath left, and he grabbed tightly onto Shilin's hand. "Your Highness." Shilin clutched his hand back. What do you want to say?" Fengxin swallowed a mouthful of blood and said through gritted teeth, "Watch out for Huacheng. Don't go near him. He is a monster." He looked like he used up all he had to give him this warning before his death. Yet, unexpectedly, the expression on Shilin's face gradually calmed. "Monster?" He let go of Fengxin's hand and rose to his feet. "I'm curious, is he more of a monster than you two?" Hearing this, Fengxin was taken aback. Yet right after those words were spoken, Shilin pulled out Fengxin in the flash of a second and pierced through Fengxin's heart, nailing him dead onto the ground. Fengxin was full of disbelief. "Your Highness, you..." But before he could finish, his breathing stopped. Shilin then pulled Fengxin out from his heart, shaking it clean of blood, before retreating to Huacheng's side, the tip of his sword pointing at the corpses of the two on the ground. "Since blood has spilled, there's no more need to keep talking through those skins," he said. A chilling laugh suddenly came from the ground. Muqing, whose body was sliced in half at the waist, twisted his neck over. The laughter was coming from his mouth. His upper half was sprawled on the ground. Even if he wanted to turn his head, half of his face should still be pressed against the ground. However, this head was turned completely around and off the ground, laughing towards Shilin. As suspected, those two were not the real Fengxin and Muqing, but were instead two imposters that came from who knows where. The real Fengxin and Muqing were still trapped in giant white cocoons, trying to gnaw themselves free somehow. When Huacheng was helping Shilin release the command talisman just now, this was what he whispered about. Their faces were pale, not because they were shocked or horrified, but because they weren't human in the first place. Shilin was already flashing his sword, and Fengxin and Muqing both smiled chillingly, speaking in unison. Just as you wish. Then they melted into 2 puddles of something that resembled thick blood. He Chang moved his shield in front of Shilian, and those 2 puddles of thick blood flowed and solidified. Bubble, bubble, bubbling like it was boiling, and soon formed into the shape of a man. Watching that ball of something contort itself to materialize, bit by bit, a series of chills went up Shilian's spine, from his waist to his neck. Soon after, the Fengxin and Mu Qing before them disappeared, and what replaced them was a tall and slender, white-clad young man. Judging by his form, this young man was about 17 or 18 years of age, and he was wearing a mask. Half of it was crying, and half of it was smiling. While his face couldn't be seen, the crisp and bright voice of a youth came from behind his mask. He said warmly, "How are you, Shilian?" Shilian's lips twitched unconsciously, his mind going numb. He Chang, who was shielding in front of him, raised his blade and lunged. Against the wicked sharpness of the scimitar Ming, that white-clad man was completely unafraid, and he sidestepped, the blade missing him by mere millimeters. Then, in the breath of a second, he flashed behind He Chang, his hand out, reaching for Shilian, looking as if he wanted to touch his face. A silver light streaked by, and He Chang blocked him, shielding in front of Shilian once more. His voice was cold. "Move your filthy hands." Then, He Chang returned the subject of that phrase back to him. That white-clad man's right hand was chopped off by Ming, and it fell to the ground. However, that did not affect him one bit. He shook out that expansive sleeve, hiding the broken limb. Then, shaking the sleeve back again, a new hand was grown from where the wound was. His fingers stiffened into claws, and he went straight for He Chang's right eye. The entire process only took the blink of a second. He Chang dodged swiftly. However, 2 bloody scratches were still left on the side of his cheek. This was the first time that He Chang could not overtake another in speed. His eyes turned sharp, and he changed tactics on the spot. He called forth millions of wraith butterflies, and they lunged at the man like mad. A myriad of butterflies wrapped that white-clad man into a silver, shimmering, human-shaped cocoon. But that probably wouldn't last for long. He Chang was about to grab for Shilian when those silver butterflies shrieked, exploding into scintillating silver powder. Seeing He Chang's face change, Shilian knew that things weren't good. Having so many wraith butterflies destroyed at once. The white-clad man who blew apart the wraith butterflies hid behind the silver powder, shimmering haphazardly in the air, and struck out with that newly grown hand, aiming straight for He Chang's right eye again. This time, it was Shilian's turn to pull out Fengxin, and he struck. His strike didn't just chop off that white-clad man's entire arm, it practically slashed half of his body. Using this chance, He Chang called out, "Your Highness, let's go." Shilian also knew that they shouldn't remain to fight, so he withdrew, and the 2 rushed out of the cavern together, bolting down the dark tunnel without any obstacles in their way. Shilian exclaimed as he ran, "It's him! He really didn't die." He Chang was the one leading the way, his speed faster, but much more at ease. He was setting up butterfly formations and silk along the way, creating heavy obstacles. "That might not be the original one," he said. Shilian came to an abrupt stop and hugged his head. "No, I can feel it. It must be the original one. Not only did he not die, he's become even stronger. Something's allowed him to be reborn. Otherwise, how could he transform into Fengxin and Mu Qing's appearances so easily? It's very difficult to impersonate heavenly officials. It should be nearly impossible to create their fake skins. Hearing his tone was going awry, He Cheng also stopped and turned around to clutch his hand. Your Highness, don't be scared. It might not be that he's become stronger. There's another possibility, and it's that he's very familiar with Feng Xin and Mu Qing. That's why he could make their fake skins. This must be someone you all... Before he finished, Shilian's gaze had fallen to the hand that was clutching his own. Seeing this, both He Cheng's voice and expression froze. He paled, withdrew his hand, tucked it behind his back, and turned around to continue onward. Shilian, however, didn't follow. Sanlang, he called out. He Cheng's body stiffened, and he paused in his step, but he did not look back, and only acknowledged, Your Highness. His voice sounded like he was fairly calm. Shilian stood behind him and said, A lot of things happened just now, and everyone's all confused and messed up. He Cheng answered. Shilian continued, Although we're all still kind of messed up right now, but I still want to take this chance to ask you a question, and I hope you'll answer me honestly and seriously. All right, He Cheng said. Shilian questioned solemnly, Just who is that noble, gracious, special someone? He Cheng's hand, that was tied with a red affinity knot, twitched a couple of times, unnoticeably. He was silent for a while before slowly answering. If Your Highness has already found out, then why ask? Shilian nodded. I see, so I didn't misunderstand you. It really is true. He Cheng didn't speak. After a pause, Shilian asked, his voice flat. You don't want to know how I feel about this? He Cheng turned his head slightly, like he wanted to look back, but at the same time was afraid to look Shilian in the eyes, so only the 2 streaks of blood on his cheek could be seen. Will Your Highness not tell me? Even his voice was cracked. Shilian said, I'm sorry. Something like this has to be said clearly. He Cheng didn't need to breathe, but when he heard this, he still sucked in a deep breath. Although his face was tragically pale, he still smiled and replied courteously. That's true. That's for the best. He was like a criminal on death row, waiting for his sentence, and he closed his eyes. Yet unexpectedly, his eyes weren't closed for long before they abruptly blinked open. A pair of arms had circled around him from behind and hugged him with force all of a sudden. Shilian had buried his face in his back and also didn't speak. Though nothing was said, it was enough. It was a good while before Shilian felt the person he was hugging turn around, returning the hold, engulfing him in a tight embrace. He heard He Cheng's staggering voice coming from above. Your Highness, you really will be the death of me.